return to roaring inflation. They're afraid
of waste and division at home, and narrowness and loss abroad. What we see is in the Tory record. It's not greatness, but the self-deluding vanity.
Thatcher's government tomorrow, with an absolute majority, will, I believe, have the effect of further tearing this country apart. We are experiencing now,
and the Labour campaign as yet, is that we have not been able to erode that Tory vote. I think we are, and that is why if you go and look at certain...
the militants would take over our country as they have taken over parts of the Labour Party. In contrast, building on our achievements, we offer a confident future for a Britain already greater.
There's division in this party now, and there is confidence in this party now, both in our ideals and in the practicality of the policies of the future.
O wild west wind, thou breath of autumn's being, thou from whose unseen presence the leaves dead are driven like ghosts.
Yes, thank you very much. That'll be enough of that. Don't call us, we'll call you. This is a poetry session, and poetry, which I'm sure you all learnt at school, is to be declaimed like that in a pompous and boring way. Poetry is about nature, isn't it? About flowers and trees and the weather and the seasons, things that don't cause any trouble. Perhaps the most famous poem in the English language is by William Wordsworth, and it's about daffodils. I'll remind you of it.
Beside the lake, beneath the trees, fluttering and dancing in the breeze.
Lovely, aren't they? Daffodils. Don't cause any trouble, never go on strike, and if you stay with them for any length of time, you'll be bored stiff. Percy Bysshe Shelley was a poet. He was more than that, he was a lyric poet, which meant that he wrote about things lyrically. His most famous poem is about the west wind, and it's divided into 5 parts. Let's hear some of that first part again.
O wild west wind, thou breath of autumn's being, thou from whose unseen presence the leaves dead are driven, like ghosts from an enchanter fleeing, yellow and black and pale and hectic red.
Hold on a moment. Have you ever seen any autumn leaves? They're not really yellow, or black, or pale, or hectic red for that matter. They're, if anything, a rather dirty orange or brown. So that's not a very accurate description, is it? And if you read poetry for accuracy, you can get pretty annoyed with Shelley. There was a Don called F.R. Leavis at Cambridge who sat in his study reading Shelley, and he got very cross indeed, especially about the second verse of the Ode to the West Wind, which starts like this.
Thou, on whose stream, mid the steep sky's commotion, loose clouds like earth's decaying leaves are shed.
Leavis asked, in what respects are the loose clouds like decaying leaves? Loose clouds, decaying leaves. He's got a point there. Quite a difficult question to answer. And the whole of the rest of the second verse is all very complicated and difficult to understand, about maenads arising from the sea and such strange Greek gods appearing without any apparent relevance to anything. As for the third verse, that's even worse. There's a reference in the third verse to the Atlantic's level powers. Now, the Atlantic has powers, of course, but are they level powers? The waves rise and fall, I should have thought, which is the very opposite of level. And the end of that verse is really quite insufferable.
While from below the sea blooms and the oozy woods which wear the sapless foliage of the ocean know thy voice, and suddenly grow grey with fear, and tremble and despoil themselves. Oh, hear.
Now, wait a moment. I don't know if any of you have any experience of sea blooms or oozy woods, but I should have thought that they find it rather difficult to hear anything And if they can hear anything, how can they hear a voice? And if they can hear a voice, how can they hear the voice of a wind? They can tremble, I suppose, sea blooms and oozy woods, but how do they despoil themselves? Do they have bowels, lavatorial functions? The whole thing really does sound quite ridiculous. And in verse 4, Shelley makes a very big mistake indeed. He starts to talk about himself, which is always dangerous for any poet. Here's the last line of the 4th verse of The West Wind.
I fall upon the thorns of life. I bleed.
Oh dear, how very embarrassing. And the last verse ends with a question.
If winter comes, can spring be far behind?
Short answer to that is no. If winter comes, spring will not be far behind. It's a bit of a banality, really, sort of thing you might get in any shop or supermarket where two people are talking. Winter's come, can spring be behind? Well, spring's quite coming up any time now because winter's come. So this famous lyric poem really turns out to be a lot of nonsense if you read it in the way that Leavis reads it for accuracy. It doesn't seem to mean anything, and that's how it's meant to be read. It's how generations of teachers and dons and literati have wanted you to read this poem. They wanted you to see Shelley as a pure and beautiful person who wrote imprecise, banal, but lyrical poetry. Now, Shelley could be a bit naughty for these people. He occasionally, for instance, wrote about politics. And the best thing to do about that, people have found, is to cut all that stuff out. Here's the Penguin edition of Shelley, which you can buy in the shops now, printed a couple of years ago. And this is by Isabel Quigley in her introduction. She says, "No poet better repays cutting. No great poet was ever less worth reading in his entirety." And so she's cut away any kind of nonsense that you happen to see in Shelley, and there's very little left. This is another very fine edition of Shelley, the non-such edition, and the introduction to this is by another professor, Professor Anthony Glover, and he writes here, "Peter Bell and Oedipus," these are two marvelous poems by Shelley, but I'm saying that, "Peter Bell and Oedipus are mainly of interest as proofs that a great lyric poet may fail lamentably outside his own proper field, especially in work of a genre that requires a sense of humor." You can imagine the professor laughing. I can always imagine professors laughing. They're the kind of people who are constantly laughing. And therefore he's cut out Peter Bell and Oedipus. He's cut them out completely. Not sad to cut them out. He's not sorry to cut them out. He's delighted to cut them out and present an entirely castrated version of Shelley. If you go to University College, Oxford, you'll see there a statue of Shelley. And it's exactly as Shelley should appear as far as the Glovers and the Quigleys and all these people are concerned. He appears beautifully naked, unspoiled in every particular, born out of the sea where he was drowned on a white marble slab, and carrying the slab all kinds of strange animals which don't exist, griffins and sea lions and dragons and things of that kind. A weird and wonderful and perfect person. And I remember when I was at Oxford seeing a little duplicated card that was stuck up just by this statue, which says, "Percy Bysshe Shelley, a great lyric poet, was at University College, Oxford from 1810 to 1811. I remember thinking that was perhaps rather a short time, and at the first available sherry party asked the dean of the college, why was Shelley here for such a very short time? I was planning to be there for a bit longer. "Oh," he said, "it's quite simple. Shelley was drowned." And that's quite right. He was drowned in 1822, 11 years after he left Oxford. The real reason why he was at Oxford for such a short time is that he wrote while he was there, in the first term that he was there, in fact, a pamphlet called The Necessity of Atheism, in which he argued the case against any gods. Gods, as far as he's concerned, didn't exist. He couldn't see any argument for a god, and he wrote a pamphlet putting that down. And then he sent it to all the bishops in Oxford and all the masters of all the colleges, asking them to have an argument with him. Didn't get an argument, as a matter of fact, he got the sack. He was expelled within 10 minutes of the first paragraph of the pamphlet being read by the first bishop who opened it, and sent packing. And it wasn't, as some people like to pretend, a youthful exuberance. You know, when people are young, they incline to be atheists. This was something that went on all through Shelley's life. All through his life, he was committed against religion, not against Jesus Christ, even if he existed. Insofar as Shelley thought that he existed, he thought that Jesus Christ's life was one of some courage and humility. What annoyed him was the organized state religion, which turned that courage and humility to the advantage of the people in charge of society.
Men say they've seen God and heard from God or known from others that have known such things, and that his will is all our law. A rod to scourge us into slaves, and priests and kings, custom, domestic sway. Aye, all that brings man's freeborn soul beneath the oppressor's heel are his strong ministers.
Priests and kings wasn't just against gods and superstitions and being told what to do by God. He was also against their representatives on earth, the kings, the monarchs, the people that had been put in power over other people, even though they weren't chosen by those other people. All his life, he was against the kings, because he saw that they were there not for any merit of their own, not because they'd been chosen, but simply because they were the sons and daughters of their parents. Even if they were mad and crass and imbecilic, they were still kings, as indeed they were in Shelley's day. The king was George III, who was off his rocker. The Prince Regent, who ruled for most of the time of Shelley's life, was worse than being off his rocker. He was dictatorial, imperious, and a snob.
An old, mad, blind, despised, and dying king. Princes, the dregs of their dull race, who flow through public scorn. Mud from a muddy spring.
That was a short political poem which he wrote to deal with the kings of his time. But in his longer, earlier poem, Queen Mab, which he wrote when he was only 18, he spat with fury from first to last against the people who set themselves up to rule over everyone else.
Whence thinkst thou kings and parasites arose? Whence that unnatural line of drones who heap toil and unvanquishable penury on those who build their palaces and bring their daily bread? From vice, black, loathsome vice. From rapine, madness, treachery, and wrong. From all that genders misery and makes of earth this thorny wilderness. From lust, revenge, and murder.
Shelley noticed there were a lot of other things about the society in which he lived which were wrong. In particular, he was interested in the role of women in society and the way in which it seemed to him that half the human race were meant to simper prettily in the background while the men played the main part in the society. He was, from very early on in his life and all the way through it, for women's liberation, for women playing a role in society equal to that of the men, and fighting to play that role. This poem, The Revolt of Islam, is really effectively, through all its many, many pages, a hymn to women's liberation.
Can man be free if woman be a slave? Chain one who lives and breathes this boundless air to the corruption of a closed grave? Can they, whose mates are beasts, condemned to bear scorn, heavier far than toil or anguish, dare to trample their oppressors?
The heroine in The Revolt of Islam is Sithna, and she pledges herself to a lifetime of agitation for the freedom of women from their oppression, and from the freedom of all oppressed people from their oppression, and for the fight to go together, and for the women to do the agitating. Here's Sithna speaking herself about what she's going to do.
Yes, I will tread pride's golden palaces. Through penury's roofless huts and squalid cells will I descend, where'er in abjectness woman with some vile slave her tyrant dwells. There, with the music from thine own sweet spells, will disenchant the captives, and will pour for the despairing from the crystal wells of thy deep spirit reason's mighty law, and power shall then abound, and hope arise once more.
There were plenty of other things that were wrong in the division of society by sex. The relations between human beings seemed to be entirely wrong. Could it be really right that love and affection between human beings were restricted to one relationship throughout the whole of life? That marriage dictated everything about the way in which people could respond to one another? In the notes to Queen Mab, which are written in prose, and in many cases are better than the poetry, he wrote the most powerful essay on free love which has ever been written in our language.
Chastity is a monkish and evangelical superstition, a greater foe to natural temperance even than unintellectual sensuality. It strikes at the root of all domestic happiness and consigns more than half the human race to misery that few may monopolize according to law. A system could not well have been devised more studiously hostile to human happiness than marriage.
That idea was repeated rather more briefly in his great love poem, Epipsychidion.
With one chained friend, perhaps a jealous foe, the dreariest and the longest journey go.
That's a quotation I recommend for you to send to any of your friends that are planning to get married. I hope I made it clear by now already that Shelley was very different to the languid fop we found on that marble slab at University College, Oxford. He was a man of very strong political ideas. He believed in representative government. He was for atheism and humanism and reason's mighty law against the superstition of religion. He was for women's liberation. And all these ideas came out of the great writers of the French Revolution, which reached its peak in 1792, the year that Shelley was born. But as he looked around him, he saw that there were different oppressions at work, even than those oppressions which had been identified in the French Revolution. He lived at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and he watched how hundreds of thousands of people were driven from the countryside into mines and factories in conditions of unimaginable squalor. He saw and detected then another kind of oppression, the oppression which arises from the ownership of property by a very few, the oppression that arises from inequality, from the division of society into rich and poor. You come across some very strange characters in Shelley, but perhaps the strangest is the character of Sir Alistair Burnett of Independent Television News, who features as the first citizen in Shelley's last poem, Charles I.
See how gloriously the mettled horses in the torchlight stir their gallant riders while they check their pride like shapes of some diviner element than English air, and beings nobler than the envious and admiring multitude.
Good old Sir Alistair, at it again. On this occasion, however, there was a second citizen standing behind Sir Alistair, watching the same royal wedding, who declares in very forthright terms,
Aye, there they are, nobles and sons of nobles, patentees, monopolists and stewards of this poor farm, on whose lean sheep sit the prophetic crows. Here is the pomp that strips the houseless orphan. Here is the pride that breaks the desolate heart. These are the lilies, glorious as Solomon, who toil not, neither do they spin, unless it be the webs they catch poor rogues withal. Here is the surfeit, which to them who earn the niggard wages of the earth scarce leaves the tithe that will support them till they crawl back to her cold, hard bosom. Here is health, followed by grim disease, glory by shame, waste by lame famine, wealth by squalid want, and England's sin by England's punishment.
health and disease, glory and shame, waste and famine, wealth and want, poverty and riches. They weren't just things to be noticed in society and be observed and perhaps written about. They were things which fed off one another, which were part of the same engine of society that were driving it on, the engine of exploitation. He put it perhaps more clearly in a very unlyrical poem. which was addressed to the men of England.
Men of England, wherefore plough for the lords who lay ye low? Wherefore weave with toil and care the rich robes your tyrants wear?
The seed ye sow, another reaps. The wealth ye find, another keeps. The robes ye weave, another wears. The arms ye forge, another bears.
Sow seed, but let no tyrant reap. Find wealth, let no impostor heap. Weave robes, let not the idle wear. Forge arms in your defense to bear.
Forge arms in your defense to bear. I always use that line when people tell me what a wonderful pacifist Shelley was and how he was utterly opposed to any kind of violence. Now, this exploitation, this robbery, what were its results? The chief result was that the wrong things were produced. People were set to work on things which were useless to them. And this he explained in another marvellous essay in those notes to Queen Mab.
The poor are set to labor. For what? Not the food for which they famish, not the blankets for want of which their babes are frozen by the cold of the miserable hovels, and not the comforts of civilization, without which civilized man is more miserable than the meanest savage. No, for the pride of power, for the miserable isolation of pride, and for the false pleasures of 100th part of society. Employments are lucrative in an inverse ratio to their usefulness. The jeweler, the toy man, and the actor gain fame and wealth by the exercise of their useless and ridiculous art, whilst the cultivator of the earth, he without whom society must cease to exist, struggles through contempt and penury and perishes by that famine which, but for his unceasing exertions, would annihilate the rest of mankind.
Shelley was a leveler. He was an egalitarian. He wanted everybody to have roughly the same from the cooperative effort. But he wasn't, as so many levelers had been in the past, what George Orwell called a bananas and sandals man, somebody who puts on sandals and eats bananas and dances around the maypole, and that's the utopia. He wasn't one for going back to the good old days, which are so often the bad old days. He was interested in science, in technology, in all the things that he saw being created around him by this new system of society, which could provide a world of plenty, where there was enough to go round, more than enough, 10 times, 50 times more than enough to go round. In the Ode to Liberty, he caught a glimpse of this new society.
What if earth can clothe and feed amplest millions at their need, and power in thought be as the tree within the seed? If life can breed new wants and wealth from those who toil and groan, rend of thy gifts and hers 1,000-fold for one.
What if earth can produce those things? And it can produce those things. Even in those days, 170 years ago, he could see the possibility of production and the failure of that production to meet the need. Could see that clearly. Wanted society to be one harmonious whole, so that what was produced could get to the people who need it. And in that desire, he pushed the ideas which had come from the French Revolution forward right into his century and beyond the time in which he lived. He wrote an extraordinary pamphlet called The Philosophical View of Reform, in which he talked about capitalists and class and the way in which society was divided and the way in which the exploitative machinery was organized. A society which turned production against itself, which didn't only produce the wrong things in the wrong order, but also in the end destroyed the means of production itself, turned the machinery against itself. This is how he put it in The Philosophical View of Reform.
The capabilities of happiness were increased and applied to the augmentation of misery. Modern society is thus an engine, assumed to be for useful purposes, whose force is by a system of subtle mechanism augmented to the highest pitch, but which instead of grinding corn or raising water, acts against itself, and is perpetually wearing away or breaking to pieces the wheels of which it is composed.
It's perhaps easier to understand that in the age of the atom bomb. or in an age when machinery is constantly being broken up as it becomes obsolescent. But then these ideas were almost entirely new, and in the philosophical view of reform, he asks himself the question, all right, suppose we get the vote, suppose we get political democracy and governments elected and representative government. What if the economy and the economic power remains in the hands of minorities and hierarchies which aren't elected at all? He didn't call himself a socialist. The word wasn't used in his time at all. But he was pushing those ideas of the French Revolution forward to new ideas which are more normally associated with the middle of the 19th century. This philosophical view of reform was written in 1820, 28 years after Thomas Paine's Rights of Man, which is perhaps the text of all those things I've been talking about earlier. Thomas Paine took part in the American Revolution. He came to Britain to start the British Revolution and was kicked out of Britain and was elected to the convention of the French Revolution. 28 years after the Rights of Man comes the philosophical view of reform. 28 years later after that comes the Communist Manifesto by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, which heralded a socialist future in which not just the politics, the parliaments were controlled by the people, but the economy as well, and everything was shared in common. These ideas were not just incidental to Shelley. They weren't sort of hobbies that he had while he was writing away at his lyrical poetry. They were central to the whole of his life and central to the whole of his poetry. He followed in his life the great popular risings with passionate interest and concern and wrote poetry about them whenever they happened. And as he wrote the poetry about them, he entwined those images of nature, the winds and the flowers and the skylarks and the clouds, with those revolutions. When the Spanish people rose up in 1820, he wrote the Ode of Liberty. Spain calls us now, as with its thrilling thunder, Vesuvius awakens Etna, the concept of the volcano, which comes up all the time in his poetry. When the people of Naples rose against the Austrian Empire in 1820, he wrote the Ode to Naples, again with the volcanoes. When the Greeks rose up against the Turkish oppressors in 1821, he wrote a whole drama poem, Hellas, about that revolution. The spirit that lifts the slave before his lord, stalks through the capitals of armed kings, and spreads its ensign in the wilderness. He was very interested in the risings that took place in his lifetime in England, in the risings of the Luddites in 1812 and 1813, in the rebellion at Pentridge in Nottingham at 1817, about which he wrote a special pamphlet, contrasting the national mourning for the death of the princess, the daughter of the Queen, which everybody said was absolutely appalling and terrible, and went into national mourning and went to church every day for a week, contrasting that with the execution of the leaders of the Pentridge uprising, which to Shelley was a far greater atrocity and a cause for much greater grief. In August 1819, a great workers' demonstration in St. Peter's Field in Manchester was ridden down by the yeomanry, which were the equivalent then of our armed police today. Shelley was in Italy when he heard the news and was so outraged that he plunged into an attic and spent several days there talking to no one, and wrote the most powerful poem of political protest in the whole of our history, The Mask of Anarchy, which starts with a tremendous attack on the Tory government of the time, re-elected again for the third time. The Foreign Secretary, Lord Castlereagh, hated by everyone he'd come in contact with. Eldon, the sentimental Lord Chancellor, who sent people to the gallows with tears in his eyes. Sidmouth, the Home Secretary, who preferred to build churches than to build houses for the homeless people. All these are attacked in the Mask of Anarchy, which starts with the depression that he was not there to take part in the operation itself. It starts with the verse, "As I lay asleep in Italy, I heard a voice from over the sea, and with great power it forth led me to walk in the vision of poetry."
I met Murder on the way. He had a mask like Castlereagh. Very smooth he looked and grim. 7 bloodhounds followed him.
And all were fat. And well they might be in admirable plight, for one by one and two by two he threw them human hearts to chew, which, From his wide cloak he drew.
Next came Fraud, and he had on, like Eldon, an ermined gown. His big tears, for he wept well, turned to millstones as they fell.
And the little children who round his feet played to and fro, thinking every tear a gem, had their brains knocked out by them.
Clothed with the Bible as with light, in the shadow of the night, like Sidmouth next hypocrisy on a crocodile rode by.
And many more destructions played on this ghastly masquerade, all disguised even to the eyes as bishops, lawyers, peers, and spies.
And as the poem weaves on, he comes at the end to return again to the slaughter of Peterloo and to call on the people of England to rise up and avenge themselves on their oppressors.
And that slaughter to the nation shall steam up like inspiration, eloquent, oracular, a volcano heard afar.
And these words shall then become like oppression's thundered doom, ringing through each heart and brain, heard again, again, again.
Rise like lions after slumber in unvanquishable number. Shake your chains to earth like dew which in sleep had fallen on you. Ye are many, they are few.
Rise like lions. That was his conclusion. He wasn't so interested, perhaps, in going along like lambs to the ballot box and changing people's lives. He was interested in people rising up in popular revolt. The volcanoes and the eruptions keep cropping up all the way through his poetry and his prose. I will arise and waken the multitude, and like a sulphurous hill, which on a sudden from its snows has shaken the swoon of ages, it shall burst and fill the earth with cleansing fire. He was a poet of the revolution. He was a revolutionary through and through. But this was his difficulty. England in 1812 to 1822, which is roughly the time of Shelley's adult life, was going through a period of reaction. The great tide of the French Revolution, which had brought all those rebellious and radical ideas to the surface, was in ebb. It was going back. It's where it was difficult to imagine at that time that such ideas should have had such force in the society. You had a Tory government which had been re-elected twice, and people seemed apathetic and asleep, while the people at the top of society were enriching themselves and stuffing their mouths with the wealth which they had created. It was a period which may perhaps seem rather familiar to people at this time. No one seemed to care. And Shelley, therefore, was a revolutionary in a period of counter-revolution. He was an agitator without an audience. No one would read his stuff. No one would publish his stuff. All these poems which we've been dealing with up to now, Queen Mab, published perhaps in 150 editions and circulated privately. The Revolt of Islam, published in a tiny edition and slaughtered by the reviewers. The Mask of Anarchy, not published at all in his lifetime, not published until 1831 and the upheavals around the 1831 Reform Bill. The Philosophical View of Reform, not published at all, not published for 100 years, and then only in this very slender edition for special circulation to members of the Shelley Society, perhaps 500 published. Can't get it. Philosophical View of Reform, this great pamphlet in our tradition. Swellfoot, the Tyrant, a great satirical poem, prosecuted by the Society for the Prosecution of Vice, the Mary Whitehouses of the time, and burnt all but 7 copies of it. This greatest lyric poet of our history made in the whole course of his life £40 from his writings. And that was from a trashy novel he wrote when he was 16, which his father had printed just to help the boy along. All these great poems were not published, or if they were published, certainly brought him no money. Why was that? How is it that his stuff wasn't recognized? Was it because of his ability? Nothing to do with his ability. Everyone knew, everyone accepts that he was one of the most able person with the English language who's ever written in it. So why was the stuff rejected? It was rejected because of his politics. It was rejected because throughout his life, he swam against the stream. He spoke against the current. His friend Byron, with whom he lived for a period in Italy, and who called him the snake, perhaps recognizing that people like Shelley at least brought some sense into the Garden of Eden. Byron wrote about Shelley one day to a friend as he looked out of the window and saw Shelley rowing in the river.
Today I had another letter warning me against the snake. He alone in this age of humbug dares to stem the current, as he did today in the flooded Arno in his skiff, although I could not observe that he made any progress. The attempt is better than being swept along as all the rest of us are, with the filthy garbage scoured from its banks.
But swimming against the stream can be a very depressing business, especially if you know what a very good swimmer you are. And Shelley was constantly haunted by the fact that he wasn't recognized. He was disgusted and irritated by it. No one was listening. He was out of touch with the emerging working class movement, which might have been interested in some of the things he was saying. His own class turned against him with tremendous ferocity. He suffered during his time all kinds of personal tragedies. His daughter Clara died at the age of 2 in 1818. His little boy William, who was 5, died in 1819. His second wife, the daughter of Mary Wollstonecraft, numbed by the grief caused by the death of her children, became isolated from him, away from him.
My dearest Mary, wherefore hast thou gone and left me in this dreary world alone? Thy form is here indeed, a lovely one, but thou art fled, gone down the dreary road that leads to sorrow's most obscure abode. Thou sittest on the hearth of pale despair, where, for thine own sake, I cannot follow thee.
When his fellow poet John Keats died, he wrote him a magnificent epitaph, Adonais, a famous poem. But in the context of this, it sums up perhaps the trough of the misery and hopelessness and despair which he reached as a result of his lack of recognition.
Peace, peace. He is not dead. He does not sleep. He has awakened from the dream of life. 'Tis we who, lost in stormy visions, keep with phantoms an unprofitable strife, and in mad trance strike with our spirits' knives invulnerable nothings. We decay like corpses in a charnel. Fear and grief convulse us and consume us day by day, and cold hopes swarm like worms within our living clay.
It wasn't just the personal grief which so many of these authoritative writers tell us was pursuing him. It was also, and crucially, the political despair, the fact that when he was striking with his spirit's knife, he was striking at those invulnerable nothings. And that lack of an audience, the fact that nobody was listening to him, goes all through his poetry, and particularly into what's called his lyric poetry. Even some of the most famous poems are about it. The Ode to the Skylark, which all of you learnt or forced to learn at school and know by heart, is precisely about this problem. Ends up, teach me half the gladness that thy lips must know, such harmonious madness from my lips would flow, the world would listen then, as I am listening now. He was tempted all through this period to give it all up, abandon his revolutionary inspiration, abandon his political inspiration, and go back to Parliament where he could become, like his father, a Liberal MP and rear sheep. And, of course, write lyric poetry, because you could do both together. Bob Southey, a famous poet, who'd written the great Ode to Wat Tyler, the peasant revolutionary of 1381, was now the poet laureate, and he was writing clever little ditties to the king and queen. William Wordsworth, who had hailed the French Revolution. Bliss was it in that dawn to be alive, and to be young was very heaven. Wordsworth was living in a great castle up in Cumbria, helping the Tory candidate at election times and writing about daffodils. Daffodils and the Tories was his election slogan. He was tempted to go back there and take up that kind of a life, but there was an awful danger in it. The danger was that he would lose his inspiration. In October 1819, he read in Delacerte's library in Florence Wordsworth's Peter Bell, his latest work. And he was so disgusted by reading what Wordsworth was writing at that time that he wrote another long poem, a satire of Peter Bell, in which he outlined what had happened to Wordsworth, who is Peter in this poem, now that he was respectable.
Peter was dull. He was at first dull. Dull, oh so dull, so very dull. Whether he talked, wrote, or rehearsed, still with this dullness was he cursed. Dull, beyond all conception.
His sister, wife, and children yawned with a long, slow, and drear ennui, all human patience far beyond. Their hopes of heaven each would have pawned anywhere else to be.
His servant maids and dogs grew dull. His kitten, late a sportive elf. The woods and lakes, so beautiful, of dim stupidity were full. All grew dull as Peter's self.
Peter Bell wasn't the only thing that he read in that library that October 1819. He also came across a long review of his own poem, The Revolt of Islam, in the Quarterly magazine, which was the equivalent, I suppose, of the Daily Telegraph or the Daily Mail today. The review was written by John Coleridge, a distant relation of Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who'd been at Eton with Shelley and reserved for him that special hatred which public schoolboys have for their fags and their friends at school who have turned turtle on their class. Coleridge's review of The Revolt of Islam is a tremendous grunt of outrage against everything that Shelley represented.
Mr. Shelley would abrogate our laws. He would abolish the rights of property. He would overthrow the Constitution. He would pull down our churches, level our establishment, burn our Bibles. Marriage he cannot endure. And finally, he would have us renounce our belief in our religion.
This great attack was met by Shelley by a great shout, which is recorded by someone who was sitting in the other side of the library. This young, rather lunatic young man yelled, closed the book, hurled it across the library, and ran out of the room. That was Shelley after reading that review. And he pretended, of course, that it had no effect on him whatever, that it didn't make any difference to him. He didn't care what people wrote about him, but of course, like all writers, when someone criticizes you, it hurts. And he was not just hurt by that review, it brought home to him the central truth of his life, which was that there was no hope of recognition as a poet, as an author, if he continued with his revolutionary commitment. As long as he had these weird and strange politics, no one would recognize him. Nothing made it clearer than the review of the Revolt of Islam, which in my view is his greatest poem by far. Nothing made it clearer than that Coleridge should write these things in the Quarterly Review and that it should be published. He was faced with this dreadful choice. He was either to be in the wilderness of isolation as a revolutionary with the ideas that had inspired him in his youth, or he was back to the dullness and the daffodils. And it was something that in the weeks after reading that review in Florence in 1819, as he went on these long walks through the city and outside the city, he brooded on and worried about. Richard Holmes, who's written by far the greatest biography of Shelley, has a wonderful passage about what was going on in his mind during those walks along the banks of the Arno in October 1819.
The criticism was working more slowly, at a deeper level of Shelley's mind. He brooded on it, though he appears to have spoken to nobody for the time being. Mary records that he visited the galleries constantly on his own during those mid-October days. The weather was breaking up in earnest now, and although the temperature in Florence remained fairly mild, the wind was getting up in the afternoon, sending high clouds streaming across the sky from the west, rushing in from the sea beyond Pisa. Shelley went for long walks by the Arno, thinking of everything that the Quarterly Review represented. Thinking of his own exile, of his passion for reforming the world, of his apparent impotence to help the downtrodden people of England, of his own disastrous private life, and inevitably at 27, of the beginning of the end of his youth. He noticed with a slight shock the premature threads of grey hair. But everything was still to be done. Sometimes his walks took him outside the city walls, into the wooded regions along the river, where the autumnal leaves streamed through the grey trunks of the birch and plane trees. He carried a notebook with him.
He connects the natural phenomena with what he's thinking about and what's worrying about. In other words, the politics merges with the so-called lyric poetry. The things around him represent ideas. The wind, the west wind, represents the spirit of that revolution, the spirit that can change the world. The leaves become, as he describes them, the pestilence-stricken multitudes, the people of the world that could throw off their oppressors. They seemed to be dead, but they weren't dead, because each of them contained within themselves the seeds which could be taken by that revolution and planted somewhere else and grow again into something quite different from the world around him, to something which could give a smell and a color and a character to the odorless and colorlessness and the characterlessness of the society in which he lived. The divided society was dull and stale and dead, but it had even within it, it had the forces of change and revolution. This is how the first verse of The West Wind goes when you see it against that background.
O wild west wind, thou breath of autumn's being, thou from whose unseen presence the leaves dead are driven like ghosts from an enchanter fleeing, yellow and black and pale and hectic red, pestilence-stricken multitudes. O thou, who chariotest to their dark wintry bed the winged seeds, where they lie cold and low, each like a corpse within its grave, until thine azure sister of the spring shall blow her clarion o'er the dreaming earth, and fill driving sweet buds like flocks that feed in air, with living hues and odors, plain and hill. Wild spirit, which art moving everywhere, destroyer and preserver, hear, oh hear.
See, the thing comes to life. The masses are yellow and pale and black and hectic red, even if autumn leaves aren't. And the spirit, the image takes on new meaning. And that is the declaration for the revolutionary inspiration of his youth. But this is the thing about him getting old, with the streaks of grey in his hair. Like all revolutionaries who get older, he realized that it wasn't quite as simple as it had seemed in his youth. That revolution had its dark side, just as it had its bright side. That the wind not only carried seeds which could make a new world, it also blew across the sky clouds which carried in them all sorts of darknesses and unpleasantnesses, rain and fire and hail and storms, which in the change of society were bound to come. Civil war, executions, famines, all kinds of things like this happen in revolution, just as the bright sides happened as well. There was an aspect of revolution which was monstrous and ugly. Monsters often represented the revolution of his time. There were working class papers called The Gorgon, which was a left-wing paper at that time. Another one called Medusa, the idea of the monster, which is put up to frighten the ruling class, which has a nasty and unpleasant and ugly side to it. His wife, Mary, had written the book Frankenstein about what happens not just when you create a monster, but when you create a monster and then abandon it, as Dr. Frankenstein abandoned his monster. All sorts of terrible things can happen. And that's what the second verse of The West Wind is about. The loose clouds are like decaying leaves, Dr. Leavis, because they're blown by the same spirit of revolution.
Thou on whose stream mid the steep sky's commotion, loose clouds like earth's decaying leaves are shed, shook from the tangled boughs of heaven and ocean, angels of rain and lightning. There are spread on the blue surface of thine airy surge, like the bright hair uplifted from the head of some fierce Maenad, even from the dim verge of the horizon to the zenith's height, the locks of the approaching storm. Thou dirge of the dying year, to which this closing night will be the dome of a vast sepulchre, vaulted with all thy congregated might of vapors, from whose solid atmosphere black rain and fire and hail will burst. Oh, hear.
All that black rain and fire and hail, was it really worth going through with it? Especially as it might not happen. What was the point, really, of when it didn't look as though there was going to be a revolution, what was the point of risking all this unpleasantness? Perhaps it was better to go back to Wordsworth and the daffodils. Perhaps it was. And yet, the point about the revolution, which impressed itself on Shelley more than anything else, was its inescapability. A society founded upon exploitation and robbery can't get away from that fact. Wherever you want to look, you can't get away from it. Somewhere or other, there's something breaking out, which is reminding you of the exploitation and the robbery that's taking place, and the ability of the oppressed and the exploited to revolt against it. The Atlantic's level powers, what are they? They're powers that come across the Atlantic from the revolution in America, reminding the blue Mediterranean, which seemed so utterly secure, of what could take place in different societies and what could take place in their own societies. He'd gone with Mary to Bayes Bay and saw there, near Naples, and saw underneath the water a whole city which seemed so secure, and it gave him the idea of how these cities, even under the sea, how even the oozy woods, do you remember them, and the blooms that are under the sea can be reached by the wind of the revolution, more powerful than any ordinary wind, can reach under the sea. Whenever people feel they're most secure, whenever the stock exchange is its highest, whenever people are at their richest and have the burglar alarms all over their houses, that's the time that they are precisely despoiling themselves the most about the prospect of all this wealth being taken away from them by the people who created it in the first place. That's where the despoiling themselves come from, and that's what the third verse of the West Wind is about.
Thou who didst waken from his summer dreams the blue Mediterranean, where he lay lulled by the coil of his crystalline streams beside a pumice isle in Bayes Bay, and saw in sleep old palaces and towers quivering within the waves' intenser day, all overgrown with azure moss and flowers so sweet the sense faints picturing them. Thou for whose path the Atlantic's level powers cleave themselves into chasms, while far below the sea blooms and the oozy woods which wear the sapless foliage of the ocean know thy voice, and suddenly grow gray with fear, and tremble and despoil themselves. Oh, hear.
The first verse, the potential of the revolution. The second verse, the other side of the coin, its ugliness and its violence. The third verse, its inescapability, the fact that it can go into the deepest recesses of society. And still the dilemma, the problem. What should Shelley do? The dilemma of all revolutionaries as they get older, which is that he'd lost that certainty of youth, the impulse which is certain and which therefore drives people to go beyond what is possible, makes them dare what is possible. The problem with getting older is that you can see that it's impossible. And he has the analogy of the child racing across the field in the countryside against the cloud up in the sky, racing to beat that cloud, and how the child will do it. They will try and reach the end of the field before the cloud does because they think they can do it. It seems obvious. There's the cloud and you can beat it. But the trouble with getting old is you know you can't. And the temptation then is to stand back and say, you can't beat the cloud. No point in running. And that's the difficulty that was faced up then in the fourth verse of the West Wind, in which he talks about how he can't reach the spirit of his youth, the impotence that's created by the inability to come back to that wonderful, clear certainty of revolutionary youth. And in that context, it's not self-pitying at all. when you say, I fall upon the thorns of life, I bleed. It means that the dilemma, the political dilemma, is impossible to resolve. That's what the fourth verse is about.
If I were a dead leaf thou mightest bear, if I were a swift cloud to fly with thee, a wave to pant beneath thy power and share the impulse of thy strength, only less free than thou, O uncontrollable. If even I were as in my boyhood and could be the comrade of thy wanderings over heaven, as then, when to outstrip thy skyey speed scarce seemed a vision, I would ne'er have striven as thus with thee in prayer, in my sore need. Oh, lift me as a wave, a leaf, a cloud. I fall upon the thorns of life, I bleed. A heavy weight of hours has chained and bowed one too like thee, tameless and swift and proud.
He is tameless and swift and proud, but he's bowed by the chains, the heavy weight of hours that chains him. And now you've got the poem poised in a sort of 2-2 draw, crying out for a result. You've got the glory of the revolution and its dark side. You've got the inescapability of the revolution, but you've got that inability of the revolutionary as he gets older to find the impetuousness of his youth. Which way is he going to go? Forward in isolation or backwards into daffodils? And the great thing about the poem is that he chooses without equivocation and without condition the first course. He chooses the isolation. He goes back to the revolutionary inspiration of his youth. He says whatever the temptation, he's not going to go back on all those things he's believed in. He's going to go on believing it. And it's that which kept him writing powerful poetry for the remaining 2.5 years of his life. It's that which inspired the philosophical view of reform, for instance. It's that which did ensure his recognition, not in his lifetime, but after his lifetime. And not by these famous litterateurs, reviewers, and people of that kind whom no one's heard of since, but by the people who matter to him, the people who actually created the wealth and could bring about the revolution he wanted so much. Between 1827 and 1841, there were 14 separate editions of Queen Mab, printed by pirate publishers, sold on the streets for a penny or tuppence or threepence, bought up by little circles of semi-literate and illiterate people who wanted no longer to be semi-literate or illiterate and wanted to change the world. Queen Mab became a great inspiration of the great Chartist revolutionary uprisings in 1839, 1842, 1858. At the end of the century, in the 1890s, Shelley became a favorite of all the new socialists that came forward to start the labor movement. The revolt of Islam, can man be free if woman be a slave, was a slogan of the women's suffrage agitation at the beginning of this century. Rise like lions is a slogan. Wherever and whenever anybody rises against their oppressors, from Mahatma Gandhi to the South African Indians in the beginning of this century, to the leaders of the unemployed workers movement in the 1930s in this country. Wherever anybody's rising up, wants to do something, get off their backsides and fight the society, people have shouted, rise like lions, and read Shelley and been inspired about it. And what's especially astonishing about this last verse is that he doesn't call upon his experience as a revolutionary, which is all about mildness, isn't it? Well, I wouldn't do that if I were you. No, no, I've got some experience. Stand back from there. No, no, I wouldn't go there. No, no, don't do that. That's what's normally associated with the older revolutionary. He had no truck with the common phrase, which you're always hearing about the place, when people say, well, if you're not a socialist, by the time you're 20, you haven't got a heart. And if you're not a Tory, by the time you're 40, you haven't got a head, which has comforted reactionaries through the generations. I'll have another brandy, please. What? I'm a Tory. I was a Tory at 40, 50, and 60, and why shouldn't I be? Shows I've got a head and a brandy. And that's the way people have thought. This verse comes directly to that question and calls not to mildness or experience or holding back. It starts off by saying, yes, I've got older, yes, my hair is going grey, yes, like the forest, my leaves are falling, and maybe I should be milder and sweeter, and then suddenly the poem stops and breaks, almost changes itself in mid-verse, and changes and calls back again to the spirits which moved him in his youth, to the spirit of ferocity, of impetuosity, of daring to do things which seem impossible, and to drive his words to try to waken up the apathetic and sleeping multitude into a fierce and impetuous revolt.
Make me thy lyre even as the forest is. What if my leaves are falling like its own? The tumult of thy mighty harmonies will take from both the deep autumnal tone, sweet though in sadness. Be thou, spirit fierce, my spirit. Be thou me, impetuous one. Drive my dead thoughts over the universe like withered leaves to quicken a new birth. And by the incantation of this verse, scatter, as from an unextinguished hearth, ashes and sparks, my words among mankind. Be through my lips to unawakened earth the trumpet of a prophecy. O wind, if winter comes, can spring be far behind?
Now, I think it means something, doesn't it?